The loading dock on the ground level of Meridian Health's central campus smelled like diesel and wet concrete, and nobody standing in it that morning had any idea that the person who would save 14 hospitals was 40 feet away, replacing a faulty circuit breaker in electrical panel 7. Inside the executive conference suite on the 22nd floor, the silence had the specific quality of a room where very smart people had stopped, pretending they knew what to do. The monitors along the north wall showed the same frozen status screens they had shown for the past 51 hours. Medication routing, supply chain allocation, patient transfer logistics, all of it controlled by a system called MAVEN, Meridian Automated Vascular and Essential Network, and all of it locked in a cascade failure that the company's most credentialed engineers had spent 2 nights and 1 full day trying to understand and had succeeded only in making worse. Miriam Voss, CEO of Meridian Health Systems, stood at the head of the table with her hands clasped behind her back and looked at the room the way a person looks at something they built themselves when it has begun to burn. "Tell me again," she said, "what we actually know." Craig Sutton, the company's chief technology officer, had been awake for 37 hours. It showed in the way he held his coffee cup, both hands too tight, and in the flatness of his voice when he answered. "We know the failure originated in the routing logic. We know it propagated through the allocation module before anyone caught it. We know that 14 hospital campuses are currently running on manual override, which is sustainable for approximately another 18 hours before patient care begins to be affected in ways that cannot be papered over. And we know," Miriam said, "that none of the solutions presented in this room in the last 2 days have worked." Craig did not answer that. The silence was answer enough. The people around that table represented a combined 240 years of education and credential. There were 3 systems architects. 2 of them brought in on emergency contracts from firms that charged more per hour than most people earned in a month. There was a team from the software company that had originally built Maven, pale-faced and visibly aware that their presence had done nothing to help their contractual relationship with Meridian. There was a logistics optimization consultant who had flown in from Atlanta the previous afternoon and had spent most of the past 12 hours generating charts that illustrated in increasing detail how bad the situation was, without offering anything in the way of reversing it. What there was not in that room was a solution. By 11 o'clock on the 3rd morning, Miriam Voss had exhausted her patience for professional courtesy. She had listened to 6 formal presentations, asked the same questions each time, received the same qualified non-answers, and watched the manual override clock tick down hour by hour toward a number that would require her to call 14 hospital administrators and explain something she did not have language for yet. She made the decision at 11:14. Her assistant, a young woman named Priya Anand, who had joined Miriam's team 2 years earlier, and had since learned to read the particular quality of stillness that preceded her boss's most significant choices, drafted the announcement in under 4 minutes. It went through Meridian's internal network to every employee at every facility within the system. The reward was $500,000. The problem was Maven. The requirement was a credible attempt. The time was now. Daniel Hurst read the message at 11:22, kneeling beside panel 7 on the ground floor, with a voltage tester in one hand and a wire nut in the other. He read it once. Then he set the voltage tester down, finished making the connection, closed the panel door, and initialed the maintenance log before he did anything else. The compressor in the adjacent room had been overheating for 3 days. It was fixed now. That mattered. He was 47 years old. His official title, printed on his badge and in the HR system that managed his scheduling and his direct deposit, was Biomedical Facilities Coordinator, which was the terminology Meridian used for the people who kept the physical infrastructure of the hospital campuses running. The electrical systems, the medical gas lines, the server room environmental controls, the backup power. He had held the position for 5 years. Before that, there were 3 years that he did not describe in detail when asked, during which he had done very little of anything, and had found that the doing of very little had its own kind of weight when you were carrying it alone. Before those 3 years, there was a career he had walked away from so deliberately and so finally that he had, in the early months afterward, wondered whether he had walked away from himself along with it. Daniel's daughter, Nora, was 9 years old. She had her mother's coloring, dark hair, gray eyes, and her father's habit of sitting very still when she was concentrating on something, which was often. She liked marine biology and competitive chess, and a small tabby cat named Fig, who had appeared on their fire escape 2 winters ago and had apparently decided to stay. Daniel packed her lunch every morning before school. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she had chess club until 5:30, and, on those evenings, Daniel timed his shifts to be waiting in the pickup lane when the doors opened. He had made a practice of simplicity in the years since everything else had become complicated. Nora, the job, the apartment with the good kitchen and the view of the parking structure that Nora had once described, very seriously, as industrial chic. He had laughed for the first time in months at that, and the laugh had surprised him, and then he had kept it. The reason for the 3-year gap, for the deliberate smallness, for the exit from a world he had spent 15 years becoming fluent in, was not something he discussed. It was not something he had ever discussed, even with the people who had been closest to him in the years before. The non-disclosure agreement he had signed on his way out of his last position had covered the details adequately. What it could not cover was what he knew. He had been a senior systems architect at a medical technology firm called Northgate Biomedical. He had spent 4 years there building the diagnostic routing infrastructure for a networked patient monitoring system called CARA, which had been licensed to hospital systems in 11 states. CARA was sophisticated, genuinely innovative work, and Daniel had been proud of it in the way that people are proud of things they have made carefully and made well. In the 6th month of CARA's deployment, a reporting anomaly in the data aggregation layer had begun producing intermittent false negative alerts in cardiac monitoring for a specific subclass of patients, elderly, with comorbid conditions that affected baseline readings. The anomaly was small. The margin was technically within the system's stated parameters. Most of the time, nothing happened. Daniel had flagged it. The response from Northgate's leadership had been methodical and, in retrospect, entirely predictable. The anomaly was within spec. The spec had been approved. To redesign the aggregation layer would delay the system's expansion into 4 additional state contracts, which represented a combined revenue projection of $80 million. The issue, as presented to him by his direct supervisor in a meeting with no notes taken and no calendar invite sent, was that Daniel was conflating a technical edge case with a patient safety concern, and that the distinction mattered. He had not agreed that the distinction mattered. He had said so in writing, which had been, professionally speaking, the end of several things. 4 months later, a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher named Patricia Hollis, who was recovering from a procedure at a hospital in Columbus, Ohio, had experienced a cardiac event that CARA's monitoring had failed to flag at the correct threshold. She had survived. Her recovery had been complicated. The incident had never become public in any way that connected it to the anomaly Daniel had documented. Daniel had heard about it through a colleague who was no longer at Northgate by the time she told him. He had sat with that information alone for a long time. He had left Northgate on a Friday with a settlement agreement and a clause that prohibited him from discussing the system or his concerns about it with anyone outside of a regulatory body. He had consulted a lawyer about the regulatory option. The lawyer had been honest. The path existed, but it was long, and at the end of it, what Daniel would have succeeded in doing was spending 3 years of his life in a process that would probably result in a minor adjustment to a spec that had since been updated anyway. He had chosen the other path instead. He had gone home, and then he had gone quiet, and then his wife had gotten sick, and then she had been gone, and then there had been only Nora, who had her mother's gray eyes, and who needed someone to pack her lunch. He had not thought about systems architecture in a long time. He thought about electrical panels and medical gas pressure and HVAC load balancing, and whether Fig needed his second booster shot. He was not thinking about any of the rest of it when he stood up from panel 7, clipped his maintenance badge back to his belt, and read the announcement again. Maven. He knew Maven. Not from Meridian, he had been at Meridian for 5 years, and Maven had been built 2 years before he arrived. But the architecture was a matter of record in the technical literature. The firm that had built it had published a case study in a systems journal 4 years ago. Daniel had read it on a Tuesday afternoon while Nora was at chess club, the way he sometimes read things from his old world, carefully, at a distance, the way you might watch a place you used to live from across the street. He knew enough to have an idea about where to look. He folded the idea away. He picked up his tools. He had a glycol line check in Building C and a ventilation audit in the East Wing before lunch. He made it to the elevator before he stopped. The thing about problems in the layer beneath the layer, and there was always a layer beneath the layer, the place that everyone assumed was fine, was that they did not announce themselves. They drifted. They accumulated. They allowed everything built on top of them to fail, in ways that looked, from the surface, completely inexplicable. He had spent 5 years working in the spaces that no one thought about, until they stopped working. He knew what that kind of invisibility could hide. He pressed 22. The conference suite was the kind of space that communicated its importance through glass and altitude. Floor-to-ceiling windows, the hospital campus spread below in a grid of rooftops and ambulance lanes, the city beyond it doing its ordinary business. Inside, the wreckage of 3 days of failure, coffee cups on every surface, printed architecture diagrams annotated in 3 colors. A whiteboard so dense with notation that the original surface was no longer visible. Patrick Criquan, who had been Meridian's senior systems engineer for 6 years, and was, by any fair technical accounting, the most capable person in the room, was presenting a proposed solution when Daniel came through the door. Patrick had worked through the previous night on a remediation approach that addressed 4 of the 6 failure modes the team had identified. It was careful work. It would take, by his estimate, approximately 96 hours to implement safely. Miriam Voss listened to the full presentation without interrupting. Then she asked one question: could any version of the approach stabilize Maven within the next 12 hours? Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said honestly that no, he did not think so. Craig Sutton had been standing at the edge of the room during the presentation with the particular posture of a man who had run out of ideas and was substituting impatience for authority. When Patrick sat down, Craig said, loudly enough for the full room to hear, that if this was the depth of analysis that the systems engineering team had been producing for 2 days, then perhaps they needed to acknowledge that the problem exceeded their capability and bring in external resources who had actually deployed systems at this scale. Patrick Kwan looked at Craig Sutton for a moment with an expression that was perfectly neutral. He nodded once and looked at the table. He did not respond. Several people in the room registered what had happened and noted it with the quiet care of people who remember things. Miriam registered it too. She registered everything. She had learned to keep that register private and long. The door at the back of the suite opened. Daniel Hurst was still in his work clothes, dark cargo pants, a gray thermal shirt with the Meridian Facilities logo on the left breast, steel-toed boots that left faint marks on the conference room carpet. His maintenance badge was clipped to his belt. He looked, with complete accuracy, like a man who had taken a wrong elevator. Priya moved toward him before he had cleared the doorway. She asked, with the efficient courtesy of someone managing a situation before it became one, whether he was looking for a different floor. Daniel said he was here for the open challenge. Priya looked at him, the badge, the boots, the thermal, and then looked toward Craig Sutton with the expression of someone who needs a decision made for them. Craig did not provide a decision. He provided an editorial. "We are not running an open audition," he said, his voice carrying the specific register of someone who has decided that cruelty is the same thing as efficiency. If facilities need something signed off on, the operations desk is on 7. This room is occupied. There was a short, quiet sound from the far end of the table. Not quite laughter. Something more like the exhale that precedes it, from one of the contracted architects who was aware of his own position in the room. Daniel did not change expression. He looked at Craig Sutton for exactly as long as it took to understand what kind of person Craig Sutton was, and then he looked past him. He found Miriam Voss at the head of the table. Miriam looked at him. It was the kind of look that she had developed over 20 years of making consequential decisions about people in abbreviated time frames. Not rushed, not performed, just accurate. The man in the doorway was not lost. He was not here by accident. There was something in the quality of his stillness, the absence of any anxiety about the room's contempt. That was not the posture of someone who had stumbled into the wrong meeting. "What's your name?" she said. "Daniel Hurst, Facilities, Building B. What do you know about Maven?" "I know the architecture. I know where the documentation stops being specific, and I have an idea about what that might mean." Miriam looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Sit down." Craig Sutton began a sentence. Miriam looked at him, and the sentence ended before it reached a verb. Daniel moved to the nearest available workstation. He did not ask for a briefing on what had already been attempted. He did not request an introduction to the system's interface. He looked at the diagnostic display for a moment and then asked, in the same even register he used when submitting a maintenance request, whether he could access the system's data ingestion layer. Not the routing logic, not the allocation module, not the error summaries that had been reviewed. The ingestion layer, the step before the step that everyone had been examining. Patrick Kwan looked up from his seat. "That layer's been audited," he said. Not defensively. Patrick was not a defensive person, but accurately. "I understand," Daniel said. "I'd like to look anyway." Patrick looked toward Miriam. She gave a small nod. Patrick typed a command sequence and transferred access without ceremony. What Daniel was looking for, which would not have been apparent to anyone watching his keystrokes, was not a flaw in Maven's routing logic. The routing logic had been examined by people who were better qualified to examine routing logic than he was. What he was looking for was something older. The foundational assumption that everyone had made about the system before they started looking, the thing that was invisible because it was supposed to be permanent. He had spent 5 years in maintenance. Maintenance people knew that nothing was permanent. Things that were supposed to be stable were simply things that no one was watching closely enough to see drift. Maven's data ingestion layer processed incoming feeds from 14 hospital campuses, patient census data, supply inventory, medication routing requests, transfer logistics, and normalized them before passing them to the allocation module. Normalization was the kind of work that happened quietly, reliably, without incident, until the moment it didn't. He found the problem 11 minutes after he sat down. Not in the routing logic, not in the allocation module, not in any of the 6 categories of failure that had been formally identified and investigated. The data normalization framework that processed incoming feeds from all 14 campuses included a handshake protocol that synchronized timestamps across systems, a function so foundational that it appeared in the architecture as a line of boilerplate rather than a component that warranted examination. 7 weeks earlier, during a scheduled update to the campus network infrastructure at Meridian's central processing facility, that handshake protocol had been patched. The patch had been categorized as a latency improvement, a minor performance enhancement that shaved milliseconds off the inter-campus sync cycle. What it had also done under a specific combination of conditions involving simultaneous high-volume requests from 3 or more campuses was introduce an asynchronous desynchronization in the timestamp alignment that allowed the allocation module to process requests using incompatible temporal references. Maven did not know the timestamps were incompatible. It allocated resources based on what the data told it. What the data told it, under those conditions, was systematically wrong. The system wasn't failing. It was succeeding at being given bad information. Daniel leaned back. He looked at the screen the way a person looks at something they have understood completely and are simply confirming. Then he turned to face the room. The ingestion layer's timestamp synchronization protocol was patched 7 weeks ago, he said. The patch introduced an asynchronous desync under simultaneous high-volume load. Maven's routing logic is functioning correctly. It's been given temporally inconsistent data. The allocation errors are a downstream symptom. The room was very still. Patrick Kwan had straightened in his chair before Daniel finished the first sentence. He was already pulling up a subroutine on his own terminal. 2 of the architects at the far end of the table had opened their laptops. The systems team from the Maven vendor had gone very quiet, in the way that people go quiet when they are calculating the exact shape of what they missed. The synchronization patch, Patrick said. He was not asking. He was processing. It was listed as infrastructure maintenance. It wouldn't have been flagged for Maven regression testing because it wasn't categorized as a Maven component. Correct, Daniel said. You'd need to roll back the patch and add a load condition validation checkpoint to the handshake cycle. That validation should surface this class of desync automatically going forward. Craig Sutton found his voice from somewhere at the edge of the room. That section was audited. That protocol is foundational. It's not a failure point. His tone had moved past authority into the specific register of someone who needs the analysis to be wrong because the alternative is worse than the problem. Daniel looked at Craig Sutton with the same expression he would have used if a circuit panel had told him the current was fine. I can walk you through the timestamp logs, he said. The desync signature is visible in the ingestion records from the past 3 weeks. If you know what temporal inconsistency looks like in this format. Craig said nothing else. Patrick Kwan's fingers moved across his keyboard. The wall display showed Maven cycling through its ingestion sequence, the same sequence that had been producing cascading failures for 51 hours. The synchronization protocol engaged, the timestamp alignment function restored to its pre-patch behavior, and wrapped in 3 additional lines of validation code, processed the simultaneous load from 14 campuses. The allocation module cleared. The routing logic resolved. The status monitors along the north wall, which had shown frozen error states since Tuesday morning, returned to operational green one by one, with the quiet precision of a system that had been working correctly all along and had simply been fed information it could not use. Patrick Kwan sat back in his chair and said nothing for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly, through his nose, with his eyes closed, the way a person does when they have been holding tension in their body for so long that releasing it requires a deliberate act. At the far end of the table, a woman from the Maven vendor team pressed her fingers over her mouth and looked at the display. Craig Sutton did not move. Miriam Voss stood at the head of the table and watched the monitors return to green. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned and looked at Daniel Hurst, who was still at the workstation in his facilities, shirt and his steel-toed boots, making a note in a small notebook he had produced from his front pocket. The kind of note a maintenance technician makes when a repair is complete, and they want the record to reflect exactly what was done and why. The room that had produced a short exhalation of contempt when he walked in had nothing to say. Miriam's chief of staff, a careful and precise person named Garrett Lynn, spent most of that afternoon making inquiries that the HR directory could not satisfy. Daniel Hurst's employee file showed 5 years of service, no formal technology credentials, a record of maintenance completions that was unremarkable, only because it was consistent. Nothing was ever incomplete. Nothing was ever submitted late. Nothing was ever flagged. The file showed nothing before 5 years ago except a self-employment designation and 2 professional references, a facilities management company in Portland and a nonprofit continuing education program. Neither led anywhere. Garrett brought the file to Miriam at 4:30 and told her, plainly, that there was nothing in it that explained what had happened in the conference room. Miriam looked at it for a moment. Then she told Garrett to go further back. What came back by early evening was assembled from sources that did not usually sit in the same document: academic records, published technical literature, regulatory filings that had become part of the public record during an investigation that had concluded 3 years earlier. Daniel Hurst had completed a doctorate in computational systems engineering at Carnegie Mellon at 28. He had spent 4 years in applied research at a defense-adjacent laboratory producing work that the people qualified to evaluate it had considered genuinely significant. He had moved into medical technology at a company called Northgate Biomedical, joining as a senior systems architect on a product that was, at the time of his departure, deployed across 11 state hospital networks. His departure had been accompanied by a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. The stated reason was mutual separation. But in the trail of internal correspondence and regulatory submissions that had entered the public record, during a subsequent investigation into Northgate's reporting practices, an investigation that had concluded with a significant consent decree and a requirement that CARA's diagnostic thresholds be recalibrated across all deployments, it was possible to reconstruct the shape of what had happened. He had identified a patient safety issue in a system he had built. He had documented it. He had been told the documentation was a problem. He had refused to let it remain undocumented. He had lost the career he had spent 15 years constructing, and he had not fought it in public, had not told anyone what he knew outside the channels the agreement permitted, had not sought recognition for the accuracy of his concern after the regulatory outcome confirmed it. He had simply left, and then his wife had gotten sick, and he had stayed gone because there was a child who needed someone to be there, without condition or complication. Miriam read the file twice. She sat in her office afterward for a long time, looking at the hospital campus spread below her windows in the early evening light, thinking about a specific kind of integrity, not the performed kind, not the kind that announces itself and waits to be recognized, but the kind that simply is what it is in the absence of any audience, in the spaces where no one is watching, where the work gets done because the work is what matters, and the recognition is beside the point. She thought about the notebook he had pulled from his pocket to record the repair. She thought about the way he had looked at Craig Sutton, not with anger, not with vindication, with the same calm assessment he might have given a malfunctioning thermostat. She thought about what it had cost a person to carry what he was carrying, without asking anyone to know about it, for the better part of a decade. She was still thinking about it when she walked back to the conference suite and found Daniel Hurst at the terminal where she had left him, reviewing the validation logs with the thoroughness of someone finishing a job to the standard the job required, not to the standard the audience would notice. He looked up when she came in. "Nora is downstairs," Miriam said. "Security called up about 20 minutes ago. She's at the front desk." Daniel nodded. He had known. He had checked with the ground floor team twice since noon. Nora's chess club had ended at its usual time. He had left a message with the front desk coordinator before he came upstairs, the way he always arranged things when his shift ran long. "I know what you found at Northgate," Miriam said. She said it without softening it, without the careful framing that people use when they are approaching a subject they think is fragile. "And I know what it cost you." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He looked at the terminal. Then he said, "It was a long time ago." "The part that mattered wasn't," Miriam said. He looked at her then. It was a long look, the kind that happens when a person is deciding whether to say something they have not said in a while. He decided against it, but the look itself acknowledged that she had found the right thing to say. The following morning, in the same conference suite, with the same senior leadership present, and the board's patient safety committee added to the group, Miriam Voss placed an award certificate and a transfer document on the table in front of Daniel Hurst. He was wearing a different shirt, still a work shirt. He was, as far as anyone in the room knew, still a facilities coordinator, but pressed, and without the maintenance badge clipped to the belt. He looked like himself, which was the only way he ever looked. Miriam slid the transfer document across the table. $500,000, as announced. Daniel picked it up. He read it with the same attention he gave to maintenance logs and work orders. Then he set it down and picked up the pen that had been placed beside it and held it without signing. "I'd like to talk about the structure," he said. The room adjusted its posture collectively. "I'm not declining," he said. "I want to be clear about that. What I'd like to propose is a restructure. There's an amount in the range of $120,000 that would allow me to purchase a home in a district with a school that fits Nora's needs, establish a tuition fund for her, and manage a transition period without financial pressure. That's what I need." He paused. "The rest of the money, I think, should go somewhere specific." Miriam waited. "There's a family in Columbus, Ohio," he said. "Patricia Hollis. She was a patient at a hospital that used a system I built. The system had a flaw I flagged, and that was not corrected. She was affected by that flaw. She has never been compensated, and no one has ever told her why what happened to her happened." He set the pen down. "I don't know if this amount reaches her, and I don't know what the legal structure looks like. I'm asking if you have people who can help me think that through." The room was very quiet. Miriam looked at him for a long time. Something in her expression shifted, not in any way that someone watching casually would have identified, but a real shift, in the quality of her attention, in the way she was looking at him. She had spent 20 years learning to measure people by what they did when no one required anything of them. She could not remember the last time she had seen someone do this. "We have people," she said, "yes." The door at the back of the suite opened before anyone moved. It was Nora. She had arrived with the building's lobby coordinator, who was a half step behind her and slightly out of breath, explaining that the morning chess club session had ended early due to a scheduling overlap. No one had reached Daniel's cell, which was in his jacket, in the facilities locker room. Nora came through the door in her school uniform with her backpack on and her chess-set bag over one shoulder. She scanned the room with the focused efficiency of a 9-year-old who has learned to find her father quickly in large rooms. She found him. She crossed the entire length of the conference table at a walk, not a run, because Nora did not run in professional settings, a distinction she had made at age 7 with a seriousness that had taken Daniel several minutes to respond to without smiling, and sat down in the empty chair beside him with the settled confidence of a child who knows exactly where she belongs. She looked at the document on the table. She looked at the room. She looked at her father. "You fixed it," she said. "I fixed it," Daniel said. She nodded, as though this were a satisfactory answer, which for her it was. She unzipped her chess set bag and began setting up pieces on the side of the table nearest her, arranging them with the quiet absorption of someone for whom this was simply what you did when you were waiting. Several people in the room found reasons to look at their documents. Patrick Kwan, who was seated nearest the door, looked at the table with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else, and was quietly, precisely, both. Miriam Voss, who had not reached the position she held by allowing herself to be undone in professional settings, looked at the ceiling for a moment. When she looked back at the table, her arge was set in the table as when she was working, to keep her face doing what she had decided it should do. Nora looked up at the room without self-consciousness, and said, with the directness that was her most consistent quality, that the table was big enough for a tournament. 3 people laughed. It was the kind of laugh that changes the air pressure in a room. The week after the award ceremony, Miriam Voss called a meeting with Meridian's senior technology leadership that did not appear on the shared calendar. She presented, without editorializing, 3 things Craig Sutton had done in the conference suite during the crisis. The public dismissal of Patrick Kwan's work in front of the full room, the refusal to allow Daniel access without her intervention, and his response when the diagnosis was confirmed, which had been to suggest, in a follow-up email to 2 board members, that the resolution had been the result of team effort and that individual attribution should be avoided. Craig had prepared a response. He did not give it. The precision of what Miriam laid out, specific, quiet, without anger, made a defense feel like a third problem in addition to the 2 he already had. His letter of resignation arrived at the end of the following week. Miriam accepted it and restructured the technology leadership group in a way that moved several of Craig's former responsibilities to the people who had actually been building and maintaining the systems. Patrick Kwan was offered the interim technical director role, which he accepted with the considered deliberateness of someone who had been in the field long enough to understand what the offer was actually saying. Patrick's first formal action in the role was a policy requiring that all infrastructure updates above a defined complexity threshold be regression tested against full system behavior, not just isolated component function. He documented the reasoning in a single paragraph that mentioned, without embellishment, that the most consequential failures in networked systems tended to occur in the layers that everyone assumed were too foundational to fail. He had gotten that formulation from a conversation with Daniel Hurst on the afternoon the crisis resolved. Daniel had said it as an aside, the kind of aside a person makes when they are stating something they have known for a long time and have simply not had occasion to say out loud. Miriam called Daniel 2 weeks after the restructuring to offer him a formal role. She had a title and a reporting structure and a compensation framework that reflected what his work was actually worth. She presented it without pressure. He listened to all of it. Then he thanked her and declined. She asked why. He said he had spent a considerable amount of time over the past several years, understanding what conditions allowed him to do his best work and to remain someone he recognized. He said a permanent position, with the obligations and the organizational weight that came with it, was not among those conditions. He said he had found that freedom was not the opposite of responsibility for him. It was a precondition of it. He asked whether a project-based consulting arrangement might be possible. He asked whether she would be willing to advise him on the legal structure for the patient compensation fund he was trying to establish, the mechanism for reaching Patricia Hollis and others whose situations resembled hers. He said he had been working through the framework for several months and had most of the structure in place, but needed someone who understood how these things moved through the relevant institutions. Miriam said yes to both. She said it quickly, without the deliberation she normally brought to commitments of this kind. She noticed that she had done that, and she filed it away in the register she kept of things that told her something accurate about a person. The house Daniel and Nora moved into was in a neighborhood with a strong elementary school and a backyard that backed up to a public park. Nora had chosen her room by walking into it and sitting down cross-legged on the floor and announcing, with the certainty of someone who has made a correct assessment, that the light was good for thinking. Fig the cat had disappeared for 48 hours after the move and then materialized from behind the furnace in the basement, apparently satisfied with his inspection of the property. On a Saturday 3 weeks after the move, Daniel spent the morning fixing the latch on the side gate, which had been stiff when they toured the house and had not improved. He had coffee going on the back step. His tools were laid out in the grass with the particular organization of someone who works with patience and does not need to rush. Through the kitchen screen door, he could hear Nora explaining something to Fig in the patient, methodical tone she used when she was certain she was right, and the other party was not yet convinced. The gate latch was a straightforward problem. The frame had shifted slightly over time, seasonal expansion in the wood, a few degrees of settling in the post, and the bolt no longer aligned cleanly with the catch, not broken, simply no longer where it had been. It took 40 minutes to shim the catch plate and reset the bolt travel, and confirm that the alignment held under the full range of temperature expansion. His phone was in his jacket on the porch railing. There were 2 messages from Miriam about the consulting structure they were building. There was a voicemail from the attorney helping with the patient fund. There was a text from Patrick Kwan asking whether Daniel would be available to review a new validation framework Patrick was drafting for the ingestion layer. When he had time, he would answer them later, when Nora was in bed and the house was quiet, which was the time he was finding worked best. The late evening hours when the small world he had built was still and settled, and he could think clearly without forgetting what he was thinking for. He was finding, in small ways, that the boundary he had drawn between his former life and his current one was less a wall than it had once needed to be. It was possible to move through it selectively. It was possible to bring what he knew into spaces that could use it, without surrendering what the years of quiet had given him. The patience, the eye for the layer beneath the layer, the understanding that the most important work was almost never the work anyone was watching. The gate swung open and closed cleanly. He tested it twice, the way he tested everything, not because he doubted the repair, but because the confirmation was part of the work. The back door opened and Nora appeared on the step with Fig balanced on one arm and an expression of settled authority. "Lunch," she said. It was not a question. 10 minutes, Daniel said. She considered this with the focused seriousness of a chess player evaluating a board position. "Fig says 5. Tell Fig I'll factor in that feedback." She went back inside. He could hear her relaying this to Fig with the gravity it apparently deserved. Daniel set his tools back in their cases, one at a time, in the order he had taken them out. He picked up his coffee. The coffee was cold. He drank it anyway. There was a kind of repair that looked, from the outside, like nothing. No before and after. No visible evidence of the work. Just a gate that opened and closed the way it was supposed to, because someone had understood exactly why it had stopped doing that and had corrected the thing that was actually wrong rather than the thing that was easy to reach. He had spent a long time learning to recognize that kind of work. He had spent even longer learning to trust that it was enough, that the repairs that held were not the ones that anyone had witnessed, but the ones that had been done for the right reasons, in the right way, in the quiet of the work itself. He closed the gate behind him when he went in for lunch. It latched precisely, the way a well-fitted thing does when everything that was slightly wrong has been made right.